from the highest standpoint, from the Vedantic standpoint, I am not the ego. That's the first thing we must understand. That's the central point. Why am I so worried and concerned about the ego is because I think I am the ego. Who am I? I. The word I, that's who I am. But the ego is just a function of the mind. Abhimanatmika vritti, Ahaṁkāra. That is Abhimanatmika, which appropriates to itself all other functions of the mind and body. I am speaking. Speaking is happening in the body with the help of the mind. And what does the ego do? I am speaking. You see, I am listening. Listening is happening there. And what does the ego do? I am listening. It appropriates to itself. It steals something that does not belong to itself. What is ego? 69. Abhimanatmikantakarana vritti ahaṁkāra. Egoism, Ahaṁkāra, is that modification of the inner organ which is characterized by self-consciousness. This should be, I don't know what you have got in your book, it should be small s, not capital S. It says self-consciousness, not capital S, self-consciousness, small s, self-consciousness. So what is ego? It is the modification of the internal organ which is characterized by self-consciousness, not a particularly good translation. I'll give you a better translation. Abhimanatmikantakarana vritti is, Abhimanam is the appropriating function. The appropriating function is called the ego. What does that appropriating function mean? Whatever is going on in the body-mind, it is taken up, appropriated, and unified by the ego. You're walking. Walking is going on. But the ego says, I am walking. Eating is going on. The ego says, I am eating. Is the ego actually eating? Not at all. Ego is just a function of the mind. It can't eat, neither can it walk. But it is the function of the mind is to, this ego, the function is to unify all these activities under one head. And that is called appropriating. It takes upon itself everything that's going on there. This is I. A thought arises in the mind. I want a cookie. I'm sorry, see, the ego is already working. Cookie, want. Then the ego comes in, I want cookie. Cookie comes from memory. Want comes from the mind. And then the ego comes and says, I want cookie. When it comes from the memory, the desire will not be there. But the traces in the mind, they come up and that it hooks that. It's a nice thing, a cookie. It is a thing to be wanted. So want and cookie are present, then the ego comes and says, I want. Then, so remember, it's the appropriating function. In Sanskrit, abhimanatmika antakarana vritti. Function of the same inner instrument. Clearly, it's not the real you. The real you is the Atman, the consciousness. It is just a function of the mind. It works, it does not work sometimes. Sometimes the ego is not present. When is the ego not present? Keep the mind very busy, you will not feel the presence of the ego. You're deeply interested in your work. A surgeon is doing very serious neurosurgery, something very fine work, maybe neurosurgery or something. Hour after hour, does not even feel I am doing it. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi calls this the flow experience. So when you have a flow experience in sports, in music, you're a doctor or an artist or a writer or even a meditator. When you get into the flow experience, the ego disappears. Why? There's a psychological reason for it. The mind has no capacity left over for generating the ego. You have focused it so much on something, there's no capacity left over. When you're intensely playing a game of tennis or something like that, at that time, you're not thinking, I am going to smash this ball. If you think that, you'll miss it. There is no time left over. The mind just reacts. In dance, in martial arts, in sports, in music especially, when you're playing an instrument, you know how to play an instrument very well. You know when it's going really well. And at that time, you don't feel, I'm going to do this next, I'm going to do that. That'll be horrible. You can never play properly if you do that. So automatically it flows. That's where Mihai Csikszentmihalyi got the term flow. The music just flowed. From that he got the term flow. There the ego will not be present. There's no cognitive capacity left over for generating an ego at that time. Afterwards, the ego can say, I played so well. I did that operation so well. So that's the ego. It will come in later. But when the ego is not being generated by the mind, are you not there? You are there. In deep sleep, the ego stops because the mind stops, so ego also stops. But the deep sleep is an experience without the ego.
You are not even the ego. Did you notice what I said? The little personality is a mask. What does the ego identify itself with? With the mind, with the body, with the story of your life. That's what the ego says it is. All of that is witnessed by the unchanging consciousness which you truly are. The moment we do that, we take a step back from the ego. Then the ego becomes an object like this. You're no longer afraid, you're no longer overprotective about the ego. The ego becomes much weaker. It relaxes its hold. Because of the reflection of consciousness in the mind. Now, the mind itself, here the author divides into two parts. One is ego. Right now, if you look into the mind, you will feel an I sense. I not in this. I as the vertical I. I am thinking, so that I. And the other part he divides and he calls it Ahaṁkāra, the inner instrument. In traditional Vedanta, here he's doing something new. In traditional Vedanta, when we study the mind, we divide it into four parts. Mano, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahaṁkāra. The mind itself, which thinks. Buddhi, intellect, which understands. Ego, which says I am thinking, I am listening. So I. And the memory, Chitta, the storehouse of all memories and impressions. So four parts, traditional division. Mind itself is divided into actually the mind, intellect, ego, and memory. Mana, Buddhi, Chitta, Ahaṁkāra. In fact, some of you who chant the Nirvana Shatakam of Shankaracharya, you will see the first line of that. The first line of that beautiful hymn where he says, I am pure consciousness, I am of the nature of Shiva. The first line is very interesting. It says, Mano Buddhi Ahaṁkāra Chittani Naham. I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the ego, I am not the memory. This is precisely who we normally think we are. The person, the little person, my memories. This ego shining in the light of reflected consciousness, this is the villain. We think we are that. Here I am. I use the word I for myself. Notice one thing. The seer and the seen are different. This book is the seen. It's different from you. The eyes are the seen. It's different from the mind. The mind is the seen. If you say the mind is different from me, the mind includes the ego. When I say I identify myself with that I. But let me ask you, do you experience the I? This is the crucial question. Do you experience your ego? If you sit quietly and do you feel I? Do you feel that? All of us, when we look into the mind, do we feel the ego? Yeah, we can say I. With confidence, we can say, yes, I am sitting. Do I feel that? Yep. I am listening. Yes. So the ego is something that is experienced. If it is experienced, it is the seen. And you are the seer of the ego. Do you see where I'm going with this? The ego is the seen, and you are the seer of the ego. Otherwise, it wouldn't be experienced. If it is experienced, it's an object just like this. Even the ego, even the I is an object. I don't mean this I mean the vertical I. Even that is an object. You are not the ego. You are not the ego. The ego shines in your light. We get identified with the ego and we think we are the ego, and the rest of it flows immediately. The ego is identified with the mind, and the ego is identified with the body, and then we think we are the body and mind. This is how the mechanism works. And the whole purpose of Vedanta is to slice this connection between you and the ego. The ego can continue working. The mind will continue working. Memories, everything, body and mind will be perfect, continue working. And yet you will know that I use the body and mind. I am shining in the body and mind, but I am not the body and mind. So the whole strategy of Vedanta is to slice the connection, cut the connection, the apparent connection between you, the witness self, and the ego. Look again at the first line of Shankaracharya's beautiful hymn. I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the memory, I am not the ego. Mano buddhi ahaṁkāra cittani naham. I am not the ego. Do you see how apparently contradictory it is? When you say I am not the ego, you know what you're saying? You're saying I am not I. The ego is the I. It says I am not the mind, I am not the intellect, I am not the memory, I am not the ego. I am not I. How could that be true? It's true because mind, memory, intellect, ego, they are all objects, they are all experienced. If they are experienced, the simple direct fact, I experience them. Hence, I cannot be those things. They are things. Just like this thing, just like this thing. So now, how do I slice the connection between myself and the ego? Verse 8. The connection between the ego and three things. We have ego connected to three things. One is consciousness, pure consciousness itself, the real you. The other one is the reflected consciousness in the mind. The ego always shines in the reflected consciousness. When you think right now, I, don't you feel I am aware? All the time you feel. The moment you think I, it's an aware I. It's a conscious I. It's an I shining in awareness. So the second thing with which the ego is connected is this reflected consciousness. And the third thing which with this the consciousness is connected, the ego is connected, is the body. Immediately when you say I, automatically it comes, I am this. So the ego, mentally draw a picture, ego, I, is connected with three things. Reflected consciousness, body, pure consciousness. And how are these connections formed and how are they cut? What is our ultimate goal? To cut the connection between the I and the pure consciousness. So I is connected to reflected consciousness, to the body, and to pure consciousness. Let's explore these connections. What does it say? Sahajam karmajam bhranti janyam trividam. Trividam means three kinds of connections. Kramat means in sequence. The connection between the I, ego, and reflected consciousness is natural, sahajam. It's like a mirror and your reflected face. Imagine your face, this face is the original consciousness. The mirror is the ego. When you put the mirror in front of the face, what happens in the mirror? There is a reflected face, right? If you have a mirror in front of your face, there is a reflected face. And this reflected face and the mirror, what kind of relation do they have? This reflected face and the mirror, what kind of relation do they have? They have a natural relation. Moment there is a mirror, there will be a reflection, right? Moment there is a mirror, there will naturally be a reflection. Your face will be reflected in the mirror. This mirror example is very good. Why? Because the ego functions as a mirror, the mind itself functions as a mirror, and consciousness is reflected in the mirror. You see, the interesting thing is, when you hold a mirror in front of yourself, what you see is the mirror and what you see is your reflected face. The original face is not seen. Correct? Your original face is not seen directly. What you see is a reflection. The mind functions in that way. The ego functions in that way. It reflects consciousness. So the awareness that we feel right now is like the reflected face. It's a reflected consciousness. We experience a reflected consciousness. We do not see ourselves as the original consciousness. That's what's happening. So the first relationship is between the ego, which functions as a mirror, and the reflected consciousness, which is natural to the mirror. Moment there is a mirror, there's reflected consciousness. The second connection. What's the connection between the ego and the body? I am this body, this feeling. What's the connection? Karmajam, born of karma. Because of our past karma, we have this body. Each body is produced by our past karma. We had many bodies earlier, we lived many lives earlier. We are in this life now because of our past karma. As long as that portion of our past karma keeps on giving results, this body will continue. As long as this body continues, the ego will be connected to this body. You can't do anything about it. And as long as the body continues, this ego will be connected to the body. And the idea is when the body dies, the subtle body, it transmigrates to other bodies, and then the ego will say, I am this body. This body is forgotten. It's burnt or cremated or buried or whatever. And then you say a new body, a baby is born, and you say, I am this. So the ego is always connected to the body by karma, by our past karma. We have two relations already. The ego is connected to consciousness naturally, one. Ego is connected to this body by past karma. These are not questions we are interested in. The real question we are interested in is, how is the ego connected to that witness self, the pure consciousness? And it comes here, the next one. That's an absolutely stunning point it makes. Bhranti janyam. There is no connection at all between you and the ego. It's incredible what it says. We think we are the ego. And here Vedanta says it has nothing to do with you. No more than the leaf shaking in the wind is you. It's something, it's an object. The ego is an object. Bhranti means error. The only connection between you and the ego is error. It's a confusion. It's a misunderstanding. It's error. There was this person who went to a Swami who lived in a cave. Give me freedom, this disciple said. And the Swami said, okay, you stay here. And they put him immediately on a schedule of duties. You clean the cave and you bring food from the village and you conduct the worship. So you have to become a disciple. Then you get the knowledge which gives you freedom. After a month of this, the disciple became irritated. He said, when are you going to give me freedom? If you don't give me freedom, I'm going to go to a different guru. Then the Swami thought, oh, I'm going to lose this disciple. So let me give him freedom. Come tomorrow early in the morning, take a bath, fast, come with a pure mind, come in the morning, I'll give you freedom. So this disciple is excited at last. And he comes in the morning and he sees the guru in the early light of the morning. He has come out of the cave and there's a big old tree in front of the cave. And the Swami, the guru, is holding that cave and saying, give me freedom, free me, free me, free me. And the disciple said, Swami, just let go. Just let go. And the Swami turned to the disciple and said, precisely. Just let go. What's the tree which we are holding on to? It's this body-mind. Most precisely, the precise point at which we are holding on is the ego. The ego will continue to exist, but what we are going to say is, I am not the ego. The ego is an instrument. The memory is an instrument. The intellect is an instrument. The mind is an instrument. The body is an instrument. It's not me. Bhranti janyam. And now we come to verse number 9. How do you cut this? How do you cut these relationships? Remember the three relationships. You, the ego, you right now. This ego is connected to body by karma. It's connected to the reflected consciousness, naturally, like a mirror and reflection. And it's connected to pure consciousness by no connection at all, by foolishness. So how do you disconnect the pure consciousness from the ego? So how do you cut these three relationships? Verse number 9. Sambandhino sator nasti nivritti sahajasya tu karmakshayat prabodhacha nivartete kramadubhe. How do you cut these three relationships? You have to remember what the three relationships are, of course, and then you proceed to cut them. How do you cut them? As long as the two terms in a natural relationship, as long as the mirror is there, there will be a reflected face. True? As long as you have a mirror, your face will be reflected in it. As long as the ego is there, consciousness will be reflected in it. You can't cut it. It will be there. So imagine in deep sleep, for example, the ego does not function and you don't feel the reflected consciousness also. You don't feel aware. You don't feel, I am in deep sleep. No, nobody feels that. If you feel that, you are not in deep sleep. So as long as the ego is functioning, consciousness will be reflected there. So the first relationship cannot be cut. It's natural. The second relationship, ego and the body. Do you remember? I am this body. How is it cut? It's cut only by the exhaustion of karma. When the karma of this body goes, this body will age and die, and the ego will proceed to another body. So the relationship between the body and the ego is cut only when karma is exhausted. And you get, but karma is exhausted means only part of it. It will generate a new body. And then you have, the ego will be related to the new body. But the main point is the third relationship. How is this cut? And the answer is prabodhat, which means by awakening, by knowledge, by illumination, by enlightenment. Just by the knowledge that I am not the mirror, I am not the reflected face. How do you cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face? This is a good question. How do you cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face? Tell me. There's no relationship, yes. By knowledge, yes. You just know that it's not me. It looks like me. It looks just like me, but it's not me. It's a reflection. It's a part of the mirror. And it's not me. Just by that knowledge, you have cut the relationship between your real face and the reflected face, which looks exactly like a real face. In the same way, we cut the relationship between the ego and the reflected consciousness shining in it and ourselves, the witness consciousness, by knowledge. See, that which is generated by error can only be removed by knowledge. That which is generated by error. The classic example, a person is walking and sees a snake and thinks it's a snake and gets scared and comes close to it and sees it's a piece of rope. It's a classic example. Now, how do you correct that thing? How do you drive away that snake? The false snake, not a real snake. How do you drive away the false snake? Do you chase it with a stick? No. All you need is knowledge that it's a rope. Then the false snake is gone. Here, all you need is knowledge that it's not me. Clearly, I am the witness. Why is it not me? Back to the first verse. Because it's an object. The ego is an object. The reflected consciousness shining in an ego is an object. It's not me. Practice seeing the ego as an object. Watch how it behaves. The moment you make the ego an object separate from you, automatically mind will be separate from you. Emotions and desires and miseries and impulses, all of them will be separate from you. You'll find the mind is much easier to control then. The mind is difficult to control because we think we are the mind. Unhappy? I am unhappy. Mind wants a cookie? I want a cookie. Right? Everything that the mind does not want, likes, dislikes, all of those become my likes and dislikes. All of those become my agenda because I have embraced the mind and think it's me. You feel the I somewhere in the head region, most of us. Now draw two parallel lines, vertical lines, one through here, one through here. Where is the I? On this side of the head, or that side of the head, or here, inside somewhere? Somewhere, right on top. Some say right here. Some say somewhere behind the eyes. Right? Something like that you will feel. Narrow down on it. It's here, somewhere, the I. You will get a vague location. Some people have an even more sharp perception, like a walnut or something there. In there somewhere. That's where the I is most evident. It feels it's something there. Okay, now the real question. If the I is something there, who is it perceiving that I there? I'll repeat the question. I am here. Okay, I'm getting it. What awareness, what is it that says that I am here? To that awareness, even this I is an object. Just as this is an object, the head is an object, the I is also a feeling, an object, an operation of the mind, being objectified by some awareness behind it. Some of you are getting it. Many are, I can see it, right? My point here is, you are not even the I. You are that which sees the I.